Well, in recent months we've seen some pretty horrific scenes, haven't we, on our streets and in our cities in the UK and even in America. Mobs of people have gathered to protest, and one of the things they've been doing is graffitiing and in some cases tearing down statues of our leaders from the past. People like Winston Churchill and Edward Colston, some previous leaders in the UK, have had their statues graffitied and in some cases destroyed. This has all become a part of a movement which has become known as cancel culture, where we tear down statues of people who were caught in activities in the past which we would today deem immoral. Whether or not this has been a legitimate practice is definitely a debated issue. But one thing we can agree on is that this shows us something very important, and it's this: that even our best human leaders are human at best. Even our best leaders from the past, if you dig deep enough into their life and if you look far enough into their history, you're going to find some flaws, you're going to find some things which will ultimately disappoint you. And so as we look at even our best leaders in our world, we're still left longing for someone better, aren't we? We're still left longing for the perfect leader. And that's kind of the feeling you get as you read the first 27 verses of 1 Kings chapter 1. 1 Kings comes right on the heels of 2 Samuel. King David is on the throne, and King David, like all human leaders, is a guy with a bit of a mixed history. On the one hand, he's been a good king. He was the one that God chose to be king of Israel, handpicked from Yahweh. But on the other hand, he's made some big mistakes. Not least the mistake he made with having an affair with Bathsheba, someone who was a married woman when King David was on the throne. And so King David's had a bit of a mixed history, but overall, when you compare him to all the kings we're going to see in this book, King David's a pretty good king. And as you can see in verse 1, King David is coming towards the end of his life. In fact, he's on his deathbed. But King David's son in this passage does something a bit controversial. He's a bit of a character, this guy called Adonijah. Adonijah's young, he's enthusiastic, he's good looking, but he's also power hungry. And you can see the outrageous thing that Adonijah tries to do in verse 7. He actually tries to steal the throne off his half-brother Solomon. Solomon's the one who's next in line, and Adonijah makes a bold attempt, outrageous audacity, and tries to steal the throne from him. And he just kind of assumes that he's going to be the next king, and he gathers all the chariots and the priests together to start this campaign to try and steal the throne off his half-brother Solomon. But in verse 8 we're introduced to a guy called Nathan. If you've read 2 Samuel, you'll be familiar with Nathan. He's a prophet who's actually the one who approached King David after his sin with Bathsheba. And the prophet Nathan again comes as God's voice. He's got great concern over what Adonijah's trying to do. King Solomon is the one who God has chosen to be the next king of Israel. And so he informs Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, who then informs King David himself. It's been an action-packed start to the book of 1 Kings, and there are perhaps 3 things you could take away from these first 27 verses. First thing you could take away is the danger of jostling for position. All of us as humans, we desire power, don't we? And Adonijah, as a sinful man, he desired more power, and he jostled for position, and in an attempt to jostle for position, he wasn't worried about whose toes he stamped on along the way. In what ways are you tempted to jostle for position? As sinful human beings, we see this everywhere, and we even see it in our own hearts. Sadly, we even see it in our own churches or church ministries. In what ways are you tempted to jostle for position? And on whose toes are you willing, or maybe currently stamping on in order to get what you want? Let this passage be a warning to you and the havoc it can cause. But the second thing we learn about this passage is how God's standards are often very different to our standards. You know, if you were to look at Adonijah, humanly speaking, you might think he's a great candidate to be king. I mean, this guy is enthusiastic. He's someone who verse 6 tells us is very handsome. In fact, he's obviously got leadership potential. He's able to start this great campaign to get people behind him. He's clearly a natural leader. But while he might be a good man in many respects, he's not God's man. Solomon's God's man. You see, God's far more interested in our character than our competence. God cares about who we are rather than what we're able to do. I wonder in what ways in your life do you value and prioritize character over competence, or in what ways are you, like Adonijah, valuing your competence above your character? God's ways are sometimes different to our ways. Don't be fooled by the world's view of success. Ensure you prioritize God's view of success. But thirdly and finally, as we read these 27 verses, we realize that even the great King David is subject to weakness, isn't he? He's subject to physical weakness. He's on his deathbed. He's no longer as able as he once was. Even death catches up with the great King David. But more significantly than that, he's subject to spiritual weakness. You see, this first chapter and these first 27 verses have been action-packed, but ultimately it's been chaos for David's family. But the reason it's been so bad for David's family is because this was a judgment that was issued to him because of his sin in 2 Samuel 11. You might remember what happened after he was caught in adultery with Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan came to him, and the prophet Nathan said to him, "Because you have done this, the sword will not be removed from your household." In other words, Nathan said, because you have engaged in this terrible, terrible sin, and you've tried to cover it up multiple times, God's going to issue judgment, that there's going to be chaos in your family. And that's ultimately what we see happening here, even in 1 Kings chapter 1. And so David's a good king, but he's clearly not the ultimate king. David's a talented king, but he's clearly not the one who's able to rescue his people. And so we're left longing for a better king, a great king. And that ultimately is the king who David's meant to point us to, the one who David foreshadows. That king is Jesus Christ.